What happens when a country starts looking north and south at the same time, fearing the next strike could come from either direction? And what if the real danger is not just one attack, but a chain reaction that could pull the entire Middle East into a much wider war? If you want clear, hard-hitting breakdowns without the noise, like this video, subscribe to the channel and share it with one person who follows global politics as closely as you do. Saudi Arabia appears to believe that moment may be getting closer. New reports suggest the kingdom is preparing for the possibility of coordinated attacks involving the Houthis in Yemen and Iran-backed militias in Iraq. That matters because those are two very different fronts. One is to Saudi Arabia's south, along a long and already dangerous border with Yemen. The other is to its north, where armed groups in Iraq have their own networks, their own weapons, and their own reasons to raise the pressure. If those two fronts begin to move together, the threat is no longer local. It becomes regional. And when Saudi Arabia feels that its ports, airports, oil sites, or major civilian infrastructure could be hit, the consequences do not stop at its borders. Oil markets feel it, shipping feels it, insurance costs feel it, diplomacy feels it, and very quickly, the rest of the world feels it too. That is why this story is bigger than one headline. At first glance, it sounds like another warning in a region already full of warnings. But what makes this different is the pattern Saudi officials say they are seeing. According to those reports, this is not just random tension. It is not simply one militia issuing one threat. Saudi officials reportedly believe there have been meetings involving Iraqi militia figures, Houthi representatives, and members tied to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. They say drones and missiles may have been moved. They believe possible targets could include economic and civilian infrastructure. Now, whether every part of that intelligence proves correct is almost beside the point. In geopolitics, what leaders believe is about to happen can be just as important as what has already happened. If Riyadh believes coordinated attacks are possible in the near future, then Saudi calculations change immediately. Air defenses go on alert, military planning shifts, diplomats pick up the phone, allies are consulted, and every move made by armed groups in Yemen or Iraq is suddenly viewed through a much darker lens. So the real question is not only whether an attack is coming. The deeper question is this: why would anyone want this moment to explode right now? To understand that, we need to step back. Saudi Arabia and the Houthis have been locked in a painful conflict for years. The Houthis took control of Yemen's capital, Sana'a, in 2014. In 2015, Saudi Arabia led a military coalition to push back against them and support Yemen's internationally recognized government. What followed was a long and devastating war. Yemen was torn apart. Civilians paid the highest price. Cities were damaged, the economy collapsed, and one of the world's worst humanitarian crises took shape. Over time, the conflict changed. Saudi Arabia learned that modern war is not only about armies crossing borders, it is also about drones, missiles, pressure points, and long-term fatigue. The Houthis proved they could survive. They also proved they could strike. Airports, oil infrastructure, and border regions in Saudi Arabia all became part of that wider risk map. Then came an uneasy period of lower intensity. There were ceasefire efforts, back-channel talks, and hopes that the temperature might finally come down. Saudi Arabia, especially in recent years, has shown stronger interest in reducing open-ended regional conflict. That does not mean it trusts every actor around it. It means Riyadh has reasons to avoid another major war, while it focuses on economic transformation, internal development, and broader regional positioning. That is what makes the current warning so dangerous. If Saudi leaders think they were moving toward de-escalation, but now believe attacks may be organized to sabotage that process, then the situation becomes even more explosive. Because in that case, every incoming drone is not just a military act. It becomes a political message. It says diplomacy is failing. It says deterrence is failing. It says there are forces in the region that benefit more from chaos than from compromise. And that is where Iran enters the center of the story. Iran does not need to fire every shot directly to shape the battlefield. Its power often works through networks, relationships, pressure tools, and aligned armed groups across the region. The Houthis have long been described as Iran-aligned. Iraqi militias backed by Iran have also played major roles in regional power struggles. That does not mean Tehran controls every detail of every action taken by every group. The reality is often more complicated than that. But even partial coordination can be enough to change the entire security picture. Think about the view from Riyadh. To the south, the Houthis sit near the Red Sea and along territory from which Saudi border regions can be threatened. To the north, Iraqi militias bring another layer of danger, especially in an age when drones can travel farther, faster, and more cheaply than many old defense systems were designed to handle. If attacks were launched from both directions, Saudi Arabia could be forced into a new type of defense posture, one where the pressure is psychological as much as physical. And there is another reason that matters. A strike on Saudi Arabia is never just a strike. This is one of the world's most important energy producers. It is a central player in the Gulf. It sits near critical shipping routes and sits inside one of the most politically sensitive regions on Earth. When a Saudi airport is threatened, that is a security story. When a Saudi oil site is threatened, that becomes a global economic story. When Saudi ports or Red Sea linked routes are threatened, that becomes a supply chain story. Suddenly, businesses in Europe, shipping firms in Asia, and energy traders everywhere are paying attention. That is why the map matters so much. Yemen is not just a poor, war-damaged country on the edge of the Arabian Peninsula. It sits beside one of the most important maritime choke points in the world, the Bab al-Mandeb Strait. This narrow waterway links the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden and the wider Indian Ocean. Ships passing between Europe and Asia through the Suez route depend on this corridor. A disruption there sends shockwaves far beyond the Middle East. We already know what that can look like. Attacks and threats against shipping in and around the Red Sea have forced major companies to rethink routes, spend more on security, and in some cases take longer journeys around Africa. That means higher costs, slower delivery, and more uncertainty in a global economy that is already fragile. So when the Houthis threaten Saudi-linked shipping, or when Saudi officials fear broader attacks tied to maritime pressure, this is not a side story. It is a warning that local conflict can rapidly become international disruption. And that may be exactly why such threats are powerful. The Houthis understand leverage. They know they cannot match the full conventional power of Saudi Arabia or its partners in a traditional fight. But that is not the only way to gain influence. If you can threaten an oil route, a commercial port, or a critical infrastructure node, you can raise the cost of every decision your enemy makes. You do not have to win in a classic sense. You only have to make stability too expensive. Now add Iraqi militias to that equation. If Saudi officials are correct that armed groups in Iraq could coordinate with the Houthis, then the problem becomes much harder to contain. Saudi Arabia cannot look at Yemen in isolation anymore. It has to think in layers. One layer is border defense, another is missile defense, another is maritime security, another is diplomacy with Iraq, another is its relationship with the United States. And above all, that sits the big strategic fear that several fronts are beginning to connect into one larger pattern. That is how wider wars are born. And this is where the timing becomes crucial. Reports suggest Saudi officials believe these threats come at a moment when diplomatic efforts involving Iran may have shown at least some room for movement. If that is true, then any attack right now would carry a second purpose beyond damage alone. It could be meant to derail talks, harden positions, and make retaliation more likely. That possibility is chilling because it points to one of the oldest truths in the region. Not every actor wants calm at the same time, and not every center of power has the same goal. If this breakdown is helping you see the bigger picture, hit the like button now, subscribe for more deep analysis, and send this video to a friend who thinks global conflict is just about headlines. It never is. In many Middle Eastern crises, outside observers make a mistake. They assume each state acts like one unified machine. But reality is often messier. States contain factions. Governments contain rival priorities. Security institutions, militias, political elites, and ideological movements do not always pull in the same direction. In moments of tension, that matters enormously. There are already whispers that internal tensions inside Iran itself may be part of the broader puzzle. The details of that are often hard to confirm, and it is easy to oversimplify. But the basic idea is important. If different power centers inside Iran see the regional moment differently, then Saudi Arabia has to ask a terrifying question. If one channel speaks the language of diplomacy, can another channel still fuel escalation? That kind of ambiguity is one of the most dangerous conditions in international politics. Because how do you negotiate with a system if you are never fully sure which voice carries the final authority? And once both sides begin reading each other through the logic of worst-case scenarios, escalation can accelerate with frightening speed. Here is where Saudi Arabia's own position becomes complicated. Riyadh does not want to look weak. No regional power can afford that, especially one that has spent years trying to project stability, influence, and control. But Saudi Arabia also does not want to be trapped into a war that consumes resources, rattles investors, and creates deeper vulnerability at the exact moment it is trying to remake its economy and global image. That means Saudi strategy has to walk a narrow line. It must signal strength without closing the door to diplomacy. It must reinforce defenses without sending the message that war is inevitable. It must respond to threats without handing its enemies the wider conflict they may actually want. And doing all of that becomes much harder if attacks begin arriving from more than one direction. So what would coordinated pressure actually look like? It might not begin with one giant, spectacular strike. In fact, that may be less likely. More often, escalation starts through accumulation. A drone attack here, a missile interception there, a claimed hit on a tanker, shelling near the border, a strike on a military camp, a threat to shipping, a new warning from an armed group, a hurried summit between regional leaders, a military exercise that looks defensive to one side and offensive to the other. Each event can be explained away on its own, but together they begin to form a pattern, and patterns are what strategists fear most. If Riyadh sees that pattern clearly enough, it may decide that passive defense is no longer enough. That does not automatically mean a full war tomorrow, but it can mean more airstrikes, broader preemption, tougher alliances, and faster military coordination with partners. Which brings us to another major part of this story, the possibility of an emerging bloc around Saudi security. Saudi Arabia has every reason to look for stronger coordination with friendly states. Turkey matters because of its military weight and regional reach. Pakistan matters because of its deep security ties, major armed forces, and symbolic role as a nuclear-armed Muslim-majority state. Any serious movement toward tighter defense cooperation sends a message far beyond the official language of joint statements. It says the kingdom does not intend to face growing regional pressure alone, and messages matter in crisis politics. They are meant not just for allies, but for adversaries. They are ways of signaling that the cost of escalation may be higher than it appears. But deterrence has limits. It can stop some actions. It can delay others. Yet it can also produce countermoves if the other side believes the balance is shifting against it. This is one reason the Middle East so often feels trapped between diplomacy and brinkmanship. Every move meant to prevent war can also be read as preparation for it. To understand why the danger feels so intense now, look at recent incidents. The Houthis have already shown they are willing to hit Saudi-linked targets and threaten routes tied to energy and trade. Reports have described attacks on tankers, strikes near Saudi territory, and pressure on military positions connected to the broader Yemen conflict. Even when damage is limited, the meaning is not. Every successful or attempted strike proves capability, intent, and reach. It reminds Saudi planners that this is not a theoretical danger drawn on a map. It is something that can touch real infrastructure, real civilians, and real markets. And Yemen itself is once again becoming more volatile. Recent fighting has underlined just how fragile the situation remains. The old assumption that the war could simply sit in a frozen state is becoming harder to defend. If Saudi forces believe they may need to support stronger action in Yemen again, whether through air, sea, intelligence, or partner coordination, then the conflict could re-enter a much hotter phase. That would be dangerous on its own. But paired with threats from Iraq, it becomes even more serious, because then the conflict stops behaving like a single battlefield and starts behaving like a network. That word matters. Network. A networked conflict is harder to predict, harder to deter, and harder to end. It has multiple launch points, multiple messages, multiple audiences, and multiple triggers. One actor may want revenge, another may want leverage, another may want to derail talks, another may simply want to prove relevance. But the result can still be the same: rising instability concentrated on one strategic state. And the United States hangs over all of this. Saudi Arabia is a major American partner. Iran has long been one of Washington's main regional adversaries. Any dramatic rise in Saudi-Iran tensions inevitably pulls American power into the background, whether through intelligence, military coordination, deterrence messaging, or crisis diplomacy. That alone raises the stakes. It means a regional exchange does not stay region-sized for long. Now think about what happens if Saudi economic targets come under sustained pressure at the same moment broader U.S.-Iran tensions remain high. In that scenario, every strike becomes more than a tactical move. It becomes part of a larger contest over credibility. Can America protect a major partner? Can Saudi Arabia defend the backbone of its economy? Can Iran deny direct responsibility while still benefiting from pressure? Can armed movements extract strategic results without triggering retaliation? None of these are abstract questions. They shape what leaders do next. And the next move matters because oil is not just about money. In the Gulf, oil infrastructure is political infrastructure. It is strategic infrastructure. It is the symbol of state capacity, continuity, and influence. When oil sites are threatened, the target is not only a revenue stream, the target is confidence. That is why even limited attacks can have an outsized psychological effect. Investors start asking questions. Markets price in risk. Shipping companies assess alternate routes. Governments quietly update emergency scenarios. Ordinary people in the region wonder whether another major round of conflict is beginning. And fear itself becomes a weapon. This is one reason the phrase civilian and economic targets carries so much weight. It suggests a strategy of pressure rather than pure battlefield confrontation. Civilian and economic sites are visible. They create headlines. They test public confidence. They raise the political cost of restraint. If a state absorbs repeated strikes on symbolic or economic assets, sooner or later domestic pressure rises to answer force with force. That is the trap. If Saudi Arabia responds too softly, it may look vulnerable. If it responds too hard, it may widen the war. And if multiple attacks happen close together, that room for careful calibration shrinks fast. At the same time, the Houthis are not acting in a vacuum. They also frame their actions within the story of Yemen, blockades, and years of war. That matters because every side in this conflict tells a different moral story. For the Houthis, pressure is often presented as resistance. For Saudi Arabia, defense is necessity. For Iran, regional alignment is framed as strategic posture. For Western powers, the language is often deterrence, stability, and maritime security. All of these narratives compete at once, but underneath them is the same hard reality. The region is crowded with weapons, mistrust, and unresolved conflicts. That is a dangerous mix. And Iraq adds yet another layer. For years, Iraq has been a place where regional rivalries play out through complicated relationships. If armed groups there become more active in threatening Saudi Arabia, even indirectly, then Riyadh has to think beyond simple retaliation. It has to think about sovereignty, Iraqi politics, American involvement, and the risk of striking blended networks. If you have made it this far, do not just watch silently. Drop a comment with the word pressure if you think the region is moving toward deterrence, or spark if you think one strike could set off something much bigger. Then subscribe, because the next phase of this story may move fast. A missile launched from one place can trigger a decision made somewhere else entirely. That is how regional systems break. And if you're wondering why this matters, the answer is simple: because the world is tied together by choke points and energy flows. When ships avoid the Red Sea, insurance rises, trade gets more expensive, and instability spreads. In other words, a drone over Saudi Arabia is not just a local event. It is a signal sent through the arteries of the global system. Now, let us talk about the most uncomfortable possibility of all. What if no one involved actually wants a full regional war, but the region moves toward one anyway? This is not only possible, it may be one of the most realistic dangers. History is full of crises where leaders believed they were sending controlled messages, only to discover that the other side heard something very different. A limited strike is read as humiliation. A warning is read as bluff. A show of restraint is read as weakness. A defensive buildup is read as preparation for attack. Then one more incident happens. One missile gets through, one airport is hit, one energy site burns, one civilian casualty becomes the image nobody can ignore, and suddenly the political space for patience disappears. That is why the idea of crossing the line matters so much here. Regions do not fall into wider war all at once. They approach it through normalized danger. First, the threats sound dramatic, then they sound familiar, then the public gets used to them. Then one day, something happens that forces everyone to realize the line was closer than they thought. The Middle East has lived near that line for a very long time. Saudi Arabia knows this, Iran knows this, the Houthis know this, Iraqi militias know this, the United States knows this. That is exactly why every side is trying to shape the next move before it happens. And yet, the more actors involved, the less controllable the outcome becomes. That is the paradox of this crisis. Everyone may be trying to send a message, but the message system itself may be breaking down. So where does this leave Saudi Arabia right now? On alert, but also in calculation. The kingdom is likely weighing several paths at once. One path is military readiness, hardening defenses, protecting key sites, sharing intelligence, and preparing for retaliation. Another path is diplomacy, staying in touch with Iraq and keeping channels open with partners. A third path is signaling, showing that Saudi Arabia is not exposed or unprepared. This balancing act is difficult, but not impossible. The real problem is that it depends on time. Time to verify intelligence, time to communicate red lines, time for diplomacy to work. And crisis time is often the one thing leaders do not have enough of. If attacks are indeed being prepared, then the gap between warning and action may be short. That forces Saudi Arabia into a compressed decision window where patience can feel risky. And for the Houthis or Iraqi militias, that compression itself can be useful. It creates stress. It forces constant alert. It raises costs, even before any strike happens. In strategic terms, that means the threat can have value before it is carried out. This is why rumors, intelligence leaks, and public warnings matter so much. They shape perception. They affect markets. They move militaries. They can even box leaders into harder positions than they originally wanted. But we should also be careful. Not every warning becomes reality. Not every intelligence signal leads to an actual attack. Not every show of force ends in war. That caution matters because fear can distort judgment. If every possibility is treated as certainty, then states can stumble into escalation. So the smartest way to read this moment is not with panic, but with seriousness. The seriousness comes from the structure of the threat. Multiple fronts and proxy actors, sensitive infrastructure, shipping risk, high US-Iran tension, overlapping crises. Those factors make this more than just another warning cycle. They create conditions where a small action could produce a disproportionately large reaction. And if that happens, Saudi Arabia would not be the only country forced into urgent choices. For Iran, regional alignment is framed as strategic posture. For Western powers, the language is often deterrence, stability, and maritime security. All of these narratives compete at once, but Gulf states would reassess posture. Iraq would face intense pressure. Iran would face scrutiny. The United States and European partners would have to respond to military and economic fallout. Global trade routes could come under even greater strain. That is why so much depends on what does not happen next. Sometimes the most important event is the strike that gets prevented or the meeting that calms a crisis. But restraint is hard to sustain when armed groups believe pressure works. And pressure, right now, appears to be rising. So is Saudi Arabia preparing for attacks from the Houthis and Iraqi militias? All the signs suggest Riyadh is taking that possibility very seriously. The reported threat fits the logic of the moment. It fits the geography of the region. It fits the way proxy pressure has worked before. And it fits the larger fear that the Middle East is no longer dealing with separate crises, but with overlapping fronts. That overlap is the real story. Because once conflicts start linking together, leaders lose the luxury of treating each flashpoint as isolated. Yemen is no longer just Yemen. Iraq is no longer just Iraq. The Red Sea is not just a shipping route. Saudi oil infrastructure is not just an asset. Each piece connects to the others. And when those connections tighten, the whole region becomes more flammable. This is why the next days and weeks matter. Not only because of whether a missile is launched, but because of what happens before then. Does Saudi Arabia double down on defense and diplomacy at the same time? Do Iraqi authorities move forcefully enough to restrain militias? Do the Houthis decide that more pressure brings more leverage or more danger? Does Iran see value in cooling the theater or in keeping rivals off balance? And does Washington help contain the situation or become more deeply pulled into it? Those questions do not have easy answers, but together they define the edge the region stands on, a place where negotiation and escalation exist side by side, a place where one drone can change market psychology, a place where one successful strike can redraw political options overnight, a place where leaders may still want to avoid war, but are forced to prepare anyway. That is the tension at the heart of this story. Not certainty, but proximity. Not full-scale war, but the feeling that several doors to it are starting to swing open. And maybe that is the most important thing to understand. The most dangerous moments in politics are not always the ones when war is declared. They are the moments when everyone can see the cliff, and yet every step forward feels less stable. If that is where Saudi Arabia is now, then this is not just a Saudi problem. It is a warning to the entire region and to the world that the next crisis is near. It may begin with a drone in the sky, a ship changing course, or a market moving in fear, and a government realizing the pressure was never coming from one direction alone. Before you go, save this video so you can come back to it as events unfold. Subscribe if you want deep geopolitical storytelling in plain English, and share it with someone who wants the full picture before the headlines catch up. Because if the region is entering a phase where North and South ignite at the same time, then the real question is no longer whether the pressure is building. The real question is who will blink first, and what happens if nobody does.